Here's an interesting question. Ask someone who was their first ancestor to join the church. I'm here with the Young Men General Presidency and Board, and I'm asking them who was their first ancestor.
And my first ancestor to join the church was the Benjamin Franklin Johnson family that joined the church in 1831 up in upstate New York. The story is recorded in my uncle's and my grandfather, Benjamin Franklin Johnson's own autobiography. And in it, he describes briefly that he had brothers that had gone away to work off in some distant place and wrote home to tell his very religious family that he and his brother had joined the Church of the Mormonites, they called it then, which caused great alarm because his family didn't know anything about this, so they're afraid they'd gone south. And so the mom gathered up all of several of the religious friends of theirs in the neighborhood and got together and started reading these letters home from the boys along with the Book of Mormon. They wouldn't let Benjamin, they called him Benny, my great-great-great-grandfather, 7 generations back, in the room because they didn't want to corrupt him. But after a couple of days, they became astonished at what they were reading and invited the rest of the family in. And Benny says that he came in and started listening, and soon he said, I was filled with the most intense anxiety to learn more. And he went on to read the Book of Mormon as a 13-year-old. He says, suddenly, I knew that there was a prophet on the earth.
All right, Brother Corbett, we're wondering, who was your first ancestor that joined the church?
Yeah, that would be my mother.
Okay.
So she joined the church in 1980. 2 missionaries came by our house. We later found out they fasted and prayed where to go. So the missionaries came by and they said, can we come and share a message with you about Jesus Christ and his church? And she said, sure. So that was a month later, she and 4 younger siblings were baptized.
My first ancestor to join the church was a woman named Huldah Wilcox. She and her husband William lived in Boston, and in the year 1820, the very year that Joseph Smith was having his first vision, her husband died and left her a widow. So she raised her children, and then in 1835, so 15 years later, most of her children were grown and gone, and she only had one dependent child that was still living with her, and that was her son named Walter Eli Wilcox. And Brigham Young was in Boston, and he was the one who baptized Huldah and her son. They were encouraged to go to Kirtland and gather with the saints, and they did. They bought land in Kirtland. After the troubles in Kirtland, as most of the saints went to Missouri, she couldn't afford to go to Missouri, so they moved to another town in Ohio where she and her son were working, trying to earn money to move up and to unite with the saints. They finally saved enough money that they were able to go to Nauvoo and join with the saints once again in Nauvoo. She got there just a few weeks before Joseph Smith was martyred, and she talked to Joseph about how much she desired to be sealed with her husband who had passed away. And so Joseph Smith encouraged Hiram, his brother, and Hiram is the one who sealed Huldah to her husband, and it was her son, Walter Eli, who stood in proxy for his father, and they were sealed together. As the saints moved west, they also went with the saints. At this point, Walter Eli was married, had a young bride, and they lived in winter quarters, and it was there that they were living in the back of a wagon, and it came time for Walter's young bride to give birth, and it was a stormy, rainy night, so Huldah held a blanket up to try to protect them from the rain as Walter delivered this baby. And Huldah, being out in the elements, got so sick that later she died there in winter quarters. But I look back and I just think, what an amazing woman. And where would I be now if it hadn't have been for her courage to join the church, her courage to be baptized, her courage to gather with the saints in Kirtland, and to not give up. even when they couldn't afford to move with the saints to Missouri, she kept earning a living with her son and preparing to go to Nauvoo. And I'm just so grateful to have her as part of my heritage as a Latter-day Saint.
The first member of the church in my family would really be Hiram Smith, the patriarch, and Joseph Smith Sr., the first patriarch of the church. I am blessed to be a direct descendant of Hiram and Joseph Smith Sr., and as a result, we go back to the early days of the church when it was founded on April 6, 1830. After the founding of the church, there were 11 people that were baptized, among them my fourth great-grandfather, Joseph Smith Sr., and my third great-grandfather, Hiram Smith. So I really feel blessed to have that heritage and being able to tie myself back to the very beginning of the great restoration of the church.
My first ancestor who joined the church was Coker Lisenby. He was born in 1804 to Mary Jane Lisenby and John Terrell. They were not married. And in fact, his father died before he was born. He never knew his father and they never married. So he was raised by his grandparents and his mother and took the name of Lisenby, and married at age 21 in the South in Alabama. Moved around quite a bit, had 10 children. When he was in Mississippi with his family and 4 children, in 1845, he came across Mormon missionaries and he joined the church. And his greatest desire was to take his family to Nauvoo to be with the saints and then to go west. And he was able to get to Nauvoo. And as they were leaving Nauvoo to start their trek west on the ferry going across the Mississippi River, the ferry burned with all of their belongings. Everything that they had burned. Children were safe. They were safe, but everything they had burned. It took him a few years to earn the money to be able to go back west. And in fact, he left, went back to Mississippi, or his sons did. He went and worked in a timber area, logging, and died in 1848 and never made it to Salt Lake. But his wife, because of his children, made it to the Salt Lake Valley, and actually were some of the first settlers in Springville, Utah.
Well, it's easy for me to tell you about my first ancestors who joined the church because it was my mom and dad. When I was a young boy, they were living in West Texas. My dad's a chemical engineer and working for Phillips there. My parents, they had at that point 4 little boys. They were talking about joining a church, and my father said he would go find some Mormon missionaries. He had lived next door to a part member family growing up. There was a young lady the same age as he was, invited him to come to church. And there was a 12-year-old boy, a deacon. And my father, when they started talking about church, remembered this 12-year-old boy and how he honored his priesthood. And so he said, I'll go find some Mormon missionaries. My mom had no idea what a Mormon missionary was. A year later, they loaded now 5 little boys into a station wagon and drove all the way from West Texas to Salt Lake City so we could be sealed. My parents had stayed in touch with one of the missionaries. One of the other missionaries, we lost track of him. And I was in my home ward in a sacrament meeting. He was talking about his son going on a mission, and he talked about an experience he'd had with the Book of Mormon in a little town called Borger, Texas. I remember there was an Elder Johnson. So after the meeting, I went up to him and said, Kent, when you were in Dumas, do you remember a family called the Mullen family? And he goes, oh yeah, there was a nice couple, and they had a bunch of little toe-headed boys. I never ever knew what happened to that family. And I said, Kent, I'm one of those little toe-headed boys. And he'd never known that they'd been baptized. He'd never known the influence that he'd had on them. And So from that humble beginning, now 11 kids and 50 some missionaries, and it's just been a remarkable blessing.
My first ancestor to join the church was born and raised in Sweden. And when he was 41, he and his wife in 1858 were found by the missionaries and joined the church. 4 years later, they traveled to the United States because most of their friends had abandoned them for joining the church. And so they traveled to the United States across the ocean, 7 children, and the 2 parents left in 1862 for the United States. And halfway through the voyage, there was an outbreak of measles, which infected almost all of their family. 3 of their children were buried at sea, and my great-grandfather was 10 years old when he came over with his parents on that ship. They immediately came to Utah, where Brigham Young sent them down to Mount Pleasant, where they helped establish the church.
All right, so Brother Vidmar, could you tell me a little bit about your first ancestor that joined the church?
Well, I've got a kind of a neat history that my first ancestor to join the church was Solomon Chamberlain, my great-great-grandfather, and he joined the church at the very beginnings of the organization of the church. He was actually baptized by the prophet Joseph Smith, and I've read his autobiography, and it's rather startling. Before the first vision, he was seeking truth. He was trying to find which church to join, much like the young Joseph was. He was an older man at the time, and he had a vision, and that the Lord's church would be restored to its apostolic authority, and that he would live to see that day. And he also had a vision that another book would come forward, like unto the Bible, he wrote, and that we would be led by that as well as the Bible. And then he went about telling people about this, and he was ridiculed for it. And then he found himself in upstate New York, and he got off a barge in the canal in Palmyra, and he asked if there were any religious happenings in the area. And someone mentioned Joe Smith and the Gold Bible, is what they said. And he says, for some reason, the Spirit manifested him. He needed to find out what this was about. And he was led for about a 3-mile walk. He spent the night and woke up the next morning and knocked on the door of Hiram Smith, Joseph's brother. And that's where he learned about the message of the Book of Mormon. And this is before the church was formally organized. So just a remarkable story. And he was baptized then by the prophet.
Wow, that's really interesting. How did you come across that story? How did you find it?
Well, due to faithful members of my family that did their family history research, and there was actually a book that was printed about all of my ancestors called The Utah Reds and Their Progenitors. It wasn't a bestseller, but it was very popular in my family. And so many of the stories of my ancestors are found in that book, but also just because my family, my father in particular, was very proud of his ancestry. And I am too, because I think of the sacrifices that Solomon Chamberlain made. He crossed the plains. His wife died in winter quarters, and I come from the roots of his second wife, and he made tremendous sacrifices for his faith. And that strengthens my faith. It makes me want to be as strong as he was, and to be as hardworking and as disciplined as he was. And his story has made me a better person. I've got a long ways to go, but I've learned a lot from my ancestors.
So I went back, looked at FamilySearch.org, and I found, and I thought I knew this before, but I found a picture. His name is Samuel Alexander Pagan Kelsey, and this is his wife, Jeanette Averett. He is my 5th great-grandfather on my mother's father's mother's side, and someone posted a little story about them online, which I'll read. In 1835, while they were living in Illinois, one day a notice was given out that 2 Mormon missionaries were to preach in the neighborhood. Alex and his wife belonged to no church. They had not been satisfied with creeds that had been taught to them at various churches. They were looking for something better. When the news got out that the Mormon missionaries were to preach, Alex's wife, Jeanette, remarked, "They should be hickoried out of the country." I don't even know what that means, but it sounds painful. Maybe a hickory stick? Anyway, to which Alex replied, "Well, perhaps they've got just what we're looking for. We'd better go hear them." They went and heard the Mormons preach, and after one sermon, they were ready to be baptized. He was baptized on the 3rd of July, 1835. They were with the church when they were driven from far west to Illinois, and Alex was one of those who was chosen to assist the poor in going from Missouri to Illinois, and when Nauvoo was settled, they were among the early settlers of that city. And my mom always told me they were sealed in the Nauvoo temple. So that's my 5th great-grandfather, first that I know of to be baptized, Samuel Alexander Pagan Kelsey, who went by Alex, and his wife Jeanette.
All right, those are some interesting stories that we heard. Now it's time for you to figure out who was your first ancestor that joined the church.